So how much does it cost to own a car? It turns out that it's really tricky to answer this question because the kinds of costs associated with cars are different from each other. As well as the actual cost of the car, you'll have recurring expenses like loan payments and insurance, as well as variable costs like gas. Every cost relating to a car changes depending on your specific situation, but that doesn't mean that you can't get a pretty good idea. We'll go over all these expenses in a minute, but first, if you're interested in coming up with numbers for yourself, we've put together a spreadsheet that includes detailed instructions and a bunch of resources. Between them and the video, you should have an easy time coming up with estimates to plug in. We use this spreadsheet to put together a few example profiles, imaginary people who will help us understand how these expenses work on an individual basis. Our first profile, let's call him Joe, is a 23-year-old in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who just graduated college and has purchased his first car, a used 2017 Toyota Camry, in order to get back and forth to work. Our second case, Sarah, is a retired 67-year-old in San Antonio, Texas, who just bought a used 2013 Jeep Grand Cherokee in order to get around town. And our final case, Frank, will be a bit more in the upper spending range. A 52-year-old living in Morristown, New Jersey, who drives to work every day in lower Manhattan in his new 2020 BMW 540i sedan. So, onto expenses. Before considering costs relating directly to cars themselves, we need to think about auto loans. In the US, about 85% of new cars and 55% of used cars are financed, so there's a good chance you'll need to take this into consideration. Obviously, monthly payments are important when it comes to your budget, but to figure out how much a loan costs, you're going to want to know the total interest. This value increases the bigger your APR and loan term get, so doing everything you can to get those as low as possible is really important. Let's take a look at how this works out for our profiles. Joe is young and doesn't have a developed credit score, but on the flip side, he doesn't have a history of bad credit either. An APR of about 7% wouldn't be too surprising, which, unfortunately for him, is well above the national average of 5.27. Let's assume a somewhat longer, 60-month term, given that he's just starting off and his budget is on the lower end. His car will cost $16,000 with taxes, giving a final monthly payment of just under $300. Between his 10% down payment and 60 monthly payments, he'll end up having spent $18,800. On the other hand, Sarah is older and, let's assume, has both a strong credit history and a car she'll be trading in, which will cut away at $4,000 on her loan right away. A 3% APR and 48-month term will give monthly payments of $190 on her $14,000 car for final interest charges of just $540. Now that's quite a difference. It goes without saying that the math starts to look very different for people with a poor credit history, who might receive loans with APRs over 20%. And as for Frank, we'll assume that he's buying his car in cash. Even though it's much more expensive at almost $62,000, he isn't buying a loan, so there's no interest. After purchasing a vehicle, but before being able to drive it, you'll have various costs. This includes not just sales tax, but licensing, registration, and dealership fees. These vary so much by state and by circumstance that it's hard to say anything concrete here, so make sure to do your research. Also, it's worth noting that while we're not going to look much at electric vehicles in this video, there are actually some serious tax rebates and exemptions depending on where you live. Insurance is the next expense, and it's a big one. These costs also vary a lot, but there are certain trends that are consistent. For example, younger drivers tend to have to pay more, as do drivers with points or accidents in their history. Credit score also plays into things. While car insurance is mandatory in every state, aside from Virginia and New Hampshire, you shouldn't think of it as just another fee that you have to pay. When you buy insurance, you're buying a product, and the minimum insurance required by most states, usually just low-limit requirements for a few kinds of liability coverage, might not satisfy your needs. The details of what car insurance does, as well as the many kinds of car insurance available, is a whole other video topic in itself. Maintenance costs are one of the hardest to predict. However, there are a few guidelines that can help. For one thing, the make of your car influences costs a lot. Toyotas are typically the cheapest to maintain, while BMWs can cost more than 3 times as much over their lifetime. Of course, age and mileage are both big factors, as are driving conditions. There's a good resource that we've linked in the spreadsheet that we use to help us come up with our estimates here, but at the end of the day, this is still probably the most variable cost. As far as gas prices go, the numbers also tend to vary a lot depending on where you live and what car you have, but they're easier to predict on the whole. The danger with gas is that the prices can change in a short period of time, so be careful to leave a good cushion in your budget and keep this in mind when thinking about fuel efficiency. On the other hand, if you're considering an electric vehicle, you'll need to take electricity costs and efficiency into account. We've included some information on the spreadsheet. This takes care of the most common expenses for most Americans, but depending on where you live, you might also have to pay for parking and/or tolls. These costs aren't so significant for our imaginary friends in Minnesota or Texas, but Manhattan is crazy. The average cost of a monthly parking space rental is a little over $400 a month, and of course, occasionally parking elsewhere within the city will increase these costs even more. What's worse is that entering Manhattan from New Jersey comes with some of the highest tolls in the United States, not to mention the fact that a number of commonly used highways in New Jersey are themselves toll roads. Aside from these, there are a few other miscellaneous costs that you'll find in the spreadsheet. For example, car washing and accessory costs. Many other costs have to do with winter, including plowing and specialized tires, but of course, these vary significantly by region. This should just about do it for costs, but the way that these costs interact with each other will depend on both how much you drive your car on a yearly basis and how many years you plan to have it. The average American drives about 13,500 miles a year and owns their car for just about 80 months. But depending on your lifestyle, length of your commute, and plans for the future, these numbers can vary dramatically. These things will also affect something else that's important: the trade-in value of your car once you're finished with it. Remember how much Sarah got when she traded hers in. The remaining value of your car is important to keep in mind, not just because it helps to offset your final costs quite a bit, but because it can help save you interest costs on your next car, assuming you get a loan. So now that we've talked about all of that, how does everything stack up? Well, first things first, it's important to figure out average monthly costs specifically during your repayment period. That will tell you whether your car will actually fit into your budget or not. Our imaginary Joe and Sarah will be spending about $600 and $700 a month until their loans are paid off. This means that their monthly payments only take up a fraction of their total cost. After that, it's useful to look at the overall cost of your car over its lifetime, and again, this varies a lot. What's interesting here is how different costs contribute in different ways to the overall cost. For example, more than a third of the costs for a guy in New Jersey will be tolls and parking, though in fairness, this is very much out of the norm. Also, given how insurance is a regular cost, it ends up being a much larger part of your overall costs if you drive less. Last but not least, we can look at average yearly costs and cost per mile. I think it's this last one that's most shocking. Most people don't think of their 5-mile drive to the supermarket as costing them $3 each way. If replacing your car with public transit is an option where you live, this might reframe the way you think about how you get around. Of course, whether or not it's cheaper to take public transit occasionally while still owning a car is a much more complicated issue, since you're still going to be paying insurance and other regular expenses. That being said, the numbers that we came up with in our 3 examples are pretty consistent with general guidelines. The IRS uses 58 cents per mile as a benchmark for car ownership costs, while the American Automobile Association estimates yearly expenses of $8,700. You should still run these numbers for yourself, though. Not only is there a pretty big range, but seeing how different things contribute could help save money going forward. So this video addressed a lot, but there's still plenty of topics relating to this question that we haven't had time to address. Don't worry, we plan on getting to them soon. In the meantime, let us know what you thought of the video in the comments, and feel free to play around with the spreadsheet. We hope you'll be around for more of our videos going forward. Thanks for watching.